Questioning and challenging the meaning of crime is one of the enduring legacies of the work of Luke Halsman. And as he and others who've long worked in this area have pointed out, what we think of as crime is critical to our understanding of criminal justice in terms of who it targets, what it targets, and how it functions. And this paper is going to look at the merits of challenging current definitions of crime and advocate a social harm approach. So my plan is to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. First of all, I'll give you a bit of background, explaining sort of how I ended up here. And then I'm going to talk about what is crime and explain why I think it's important to continue challenging common sense understandings of crime and criminality. And I'll explain a social harm approach. And then what I'll do is try and give you some practical examples of kind of where this approach has been applied and where we found it useful in research and policy work, in the work that I've been involved in at the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. And I want to leave some time at the end because I'd be really interested to hear what people think about these strategies, other strategies that you've used, ideas you've got. So first of all, the background. I was involved in some research interviewing a number of UK and European abolitionists as part of my master's thesis. And I was asking people what happened to abolitionism as a paradigm in a social movement. And as part of the interviews, I asked people what abolitionism meant to them. And from these personal accounts, it seemed that there were three main focal points for abolitionist activities. Most people talked about prisons. And it'd be interesting maybe if you're looking at this thinking kind of where you think you sit on that spectrum. And there's obviously overlap between them as well. And most people talked about prison. And the exception was with Luke Halsman when I spoke to him, and he talked about the elimination and replacement of language around crime. And he favoured a reclassification and reconsideration of crime in terms of problematic events. And in fact, in the interviews I conducted, most described Luke as having the extreme position. And many people sort of emphasised their kind of comparatively moderate stance. But the thing is, I didn't really see Luke's position as being particularly extreme or radical, and I'll come back to that a bit later, but I saw real merits in challenging the concept of crime, and it sort of directly related to some of the work I was involved in my day job. So I'll explain a bit about the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. It says on my badge that I'm at King's College, and we've kind of been squatting there for a number of years, and we've been thrown out in a couple of weeks, so we're moving. We're an independent charity. We finally realised we were there, and we're moving offices. So I've worked at CCJS for about 6 years, and I'll just give you a chance to read this. We're an independent public interest charity that sits between the worlds of research and policy, practice and campaigning. Now we're actually in a process of redrawing our mission and aim, so this is kind of a working draft, and what we've sort of been trying to get rid of the crime and introducing notions about social harm and social justice. And our mission is to inspire enduring change by promoting understanding of social harm, the centrality of social justice and the limits of criminal justice. Our vision is of a socially just society in which everyone benefits from equality, safety, economic and social security. Now, I was initially employed at CCJS to work on a project called the Crime and Society Foundation, and we've been given lots of money to be a new think tank on crime and justice. And in the early days, my interpretation of what we wanted to do was make the criminal justice system a bit smaller, reduce crime, and make prisons a bit nicer for people. And that was kind of what I thought at the time. And the typical explanation I would give to people was that New Labour had sort of talked about being tough on crime and being tough on the causes of crime. And they'd been very good at being tough, but they hadn't sort of tackled the causes. And what we wanted to do was work out how to tackle those causes. And so we did a lot of reading and talking to people and discussing amongst ourselves. And one of the people we came across was Jeffrey Wyman, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And he talks about sort of this criminal justice system as being a carnival mirror image of society and kind of distorting reality. He says, we're led to believe that the criminal justice system is protecting us against the gravest threats, when actually the system is protecting us against only some threats and not necessarily the gravest ones. And what we became focused on was the sort of partiality of criminal... Okay, and then the second part of this is he says, if people believe that the carnival mirror is true, they come to believe that whatever is the target of the criminal justice system must be the greatest threat to their well-being. And so we read Stephen Box, and we read Halsman, we read Popinski and Jesselo, we read Quinney, Shearer, Steiner, and then suddenly tackling the causes of crime didn't seem quite so important. barking up the wrong tree. So when we discovered social harm, and actually I'm talking about social harm, and Paddy Hilliard, who's also at Queen's University, was one of the people involved in developing it. So, my colleague Will went to the European Group for Deviancy and Social Control. He went to a conference of theirs in Bristol. And there was a launch of a book called Beyond Criminology. And this book was targeted really at an academic audience, and it criticised the narrow focus of criminology. Drawing on the work of critical criminologists, they focused on the concept of crime, and at the heart of their argument, they used the phrase from Luke Horsman when they said that crime had no ontological reality. And Will came back from the conference, he ordered us all copies, and he said, you must read this, this is what we need to focus on instead. And what they did in this book was they argued that focusing on crime perpetuates some of the myths around criminal justice. And by focusing on crime, we focus on petty events rather than serious harms. They talked about the historical and political economic basis upon which most crime definitions and criminal justice has emerged, and how it kind of often serves to maintain power relations, and also how crime control is largely ineffective. They showed how social harm relates to social and economic inequalities that are at the heart of the liberal state. And rather than simply focusing on harms identified by the criminal justice system, they wanted to look beyond crime definitions. And they looked at a number of categories such as physical harm, mental harm, financial harm and sexual harm. Now, I'm not sure it might be clearer on the handout, but Christina Pantazis and Simon Pemberton, who are both based at Bristol University, have sort of tried to take this a bit further and kind of work out how we might use this in terms of research agendas and campaigning and analysing social harm. And they came across Doyle and Goff, and that they list human needs. So what they've tried to do is sort of start looking at how societies meet social needs. And they list them as basic needs, and at the top you've got physical health and autonomy, and then intermediate needs. And there's a whole list there: education, transport, housing. And an example of how they've done this, so they've sort of drawn on quite a wide range of data from the World Health Organization and loads of different sources, and tried to compare countries and look at how they meet their social needs. And there are obviously some interesting comparisons, and there's some interesting discussions you can have about the way in which those societies organise themselves and why some are better at meeting needs than others. And one of the key strengths of this perspective is that it demands an interdisciplinary response at both policymaker and service delivery level. So we're not talking about criminal justice here, we're talking about social policy, political economy, a much wider perspective. And for the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies, it's meant that we've been able to reach out to a wider range of disciplines than the criminologists that we've been talking to before. So we've talked to people in public health, epidemiology, social policy, international relations, geography, labour relations, and it's just a few of them. And sort of in an attempt to understand and develop responses to the many predictable and preventable harms that are experienced in contemporary society. I can't remember why I know why I put this quote in, but it kind of is a bit of a funny place. But anyway, this is Frederick Engels. And this is one of my favourite quotes, but he says, when one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another, which leads to the death of a person, we call it manslaughter. On the other hand, if the person knows beforehand the blow will be fatal, we call it murder. Murder has also been committed if society places hundreds of workers in such a position that they inevitably come to a premature and unnatural end. Their death is as violent as if they'd been stabbed or shot, and murder has been committed if society knows perfectly well that thousands of workers cannot avoid being sacrificed, as long as these conditions are allowed to continue. Now, I mean, I'd sort of broaden this out beyond workers, because a lot of people don't work in sort of sense that you could read that. And it, sort of, I guess, taking this further, we've been looking at issues around early death and how people die early when they didn't need to, and actually that there are mechanisms we could put in place that either stop those deaths being caused or prevent them. So, pretty picture here. So the point is, that's what we're trying to say, there's all this harm out there, and then there's this tiny blob called crime. And some of it's harmful and some of it isn't. And if you look at the way in which the criminal justice system operates, it probably just deals with a pinprick of that crime. And so what we're saying is that by focusing predominantly on the many acts of sort of crime through the narrow framework of criminal justice, there's a tendency to place disproportionate emphasis on particular people committing particular kinds of offences. And this deflects attention away from far more wide-ranging and pervasive harms and sort of some much more interesting questions, I think.